thank you, Munir and Christine, for inviting me to come and speak here today. And what better place to start with than prevention? There's so much stratified medicine at the moment seems to be focusing on diagnosis and treatment, and wonderful though that is, as a public health consultant, we always really want to start with how can we use these fantastic new technologies to understand prevention and how to stratify the population according to risk. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk a little bit and introduce you to the different levels of prevention as public health consultants. We talk about primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. I'm going to talk about how we can start to understand risk and prevention in a more personalised way. And then I'm going to think about how we implement that, and it's really rather complex on a population basis, particularly thinking about patient empowerment or person empowerment, not all patients at that stage, how we need to develop the healthcare systems to accommodate this, and how that would actually interface with classical public health practice, and finally some of the complexities over delivering the evidence base. So that's my outline today. And if we think about the challenges facing healthcare, these are always the ones that are trotted out by, if you look at Simon Stevens' 5-year health service plan, forward view, you know, the problems of increasing population and increasingly elderly population, patients having the most vast expectations that health technologies can deliver everything and solve every problem for them. And actually the scientific and technological advances are also actually often seen as part of the problem, rather than as we would probably all say we should be harnessing to be part of the solution. And so actually, if you look even at the newspapers in the last few days, there's almost a perfect storm that's expected within the NHS health systems and all around the world as they're all trying to grapple with what they see as a load of extra complexities and problems. And mostly the solutions are orientated around placing the individual at the centre, so the idea of patient's empowerment, and an increasing emphasis on prevention. That's in both the NHS plan at the moment and in Public Health England's forward plans. And as well, obviously, reorganisation to move care from the hospital to the community as far as possible. I'm not going to talk so much about that today. So if we think about disease prevention, the public health mantra is always primary, secondary and tertiary. Primary prevention is usually orientated towards risk. It's trying to stop people being exposed to disease or getting disease in the first place. So vaccination, making sure that people stop smoking, take plenty of exercise, have a good diet, all stopping them getting these major diseases in the first place. Secondary prevention is about spotting early disease, and so I put up Mammography or the breast screening program is a good example of that. But really what we're doing is you're spotting breast cancer early with the hope of treating it and curing it. And finally the tertiary prevention, where and a lot of stratified medicine is orientated around that, in the sense of making a good early diagnosis and then treating it very effectively, rehabilitating, getting people back into the community, and making sure that long-term disability and handicap is as low as possible. And if we think about primary prevention, we can go back to the 19th century really on this to start off with, where we were worried about housing, clean water, exposure to infectious diseases, or not having enough food, or having the wrong sorts of food, exposures to radiation and so on. And these are actually all things that are still very important in society, and particularly around the world, where people don't have access to clean water or enough food or good food. In the 20th century, we moved much more towards thinking about lifestyle, and so smoking, the obesity, the taking plenty of exercise became very important parts of the programs at a national level to try to improve health. And Geoffrey Rose, as an epidemiologist, was one of the sort of classic paradigms really of how you do prevent disease, and he talked about two different approaches which were to some extent complementary. So the first one, if you look at the graph there, that's a sort of graph of exposure, and basically it's saying that if you look at the exposure of the population to risk, whether it's smoking level, whether it's blood pressure, that it basically follows a normal distribution. And if by reducing salt intake, for example, or reducing people's average blood pressure, or getting everybody to take exercise, you will reduce the population mean for that exposure and reduce the population level of risk. And so all of the things that are really aimed at the whole population are aimed at moving the whole population risk a little bit to the left-hand side. And of course what happens there is that lots of people are worried, are inconvenienced, or are potentially exposed to the harm of things like breast screening, and most people actually won't have very much opportunity to benefit. And actually it's quite hard to motivate change in people when actually they don't really see their particular risk of something. So stopping smoking, as we all know, changing exercise, changing our diet is actually very difficult if we only perceive ourselves as having average risk. So his alternate strategy was to try and spot people that are at high risk, so people that have very high blood pressures or people that have very high cholesterol levels. You usually have to do some sort of a test for those people, and you risk medicalising them, but those people may at least be more motivated to have the treatments that you offer. So he proposed two alternative strategies, either the population or the high-risk approach. But with stratified prevention, what you're actually thinking is that you would stratify across the whole of the population, so you'd identify people at low, medium and high risk. The people at low risk may not have to take any actions. People at high risk or moderate or high risk would have an action or an intervention that was tailored towards their particular risk. And the idea is that these interventions would be more effective, they'd be more cost effective, and also we wouldn't have the risk of overdiagnosis that we have, say, for example, with prostate screening or breast screening at the moment, and so we reduce the risk of harm. So if we think now about the components of risk, the determinants of risk, nearly all diseases, it's a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Even road traffic accidents actually have genetic factors in that there are people slightly more likely to put themselves in harm's way. So if we just talk about some of these, the single gene disorders, this is where there is one mutation in the gene that causes overriding harm, and that gene in itself, that mutation, is sufficient to cause serious diseases such as, for example, cystic fibrosis, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But most diseases are multifactorial in origin, so if we're thinking about heart disease, diabetes, most forms of kidney disease, most chronic diseases, it's a combination of sort of genetic susceptibility and a variety of environmental exposures. And indeed, if we look at particular environmental exposures, it becomes clear that the susceptibility, for example, to harm from smoking is in some ways genetically determined, and the same way from environmental hazards, things such as radiation or exposure to paints or solvents or whatever. Everybody who's exposed doesn't get disease. The susceptibility to disease, given those exposures, is genetically determined. The same with food, the same with medicines, and we're very interested here in pharmacogenetics and the fact that some people will respond differently physiologically to different medications. And equally with infectious diseases, everybody who's exposed will not necessarily get disease. Some people given disease will have a much more serious outcome, and a lot of that is genetically determined. So how do we intervene to prevent disease? In the single gene disorders, again, they're quite rare disorders, but there are an awful lot of them. And in fact, 1 in 17 of the population actually has one of these rare disorders. So even on a population basis, they're quite a serious source of morbidity and mortality and need for health care. So with single gene disorders, we have the options of preconception or prenatal testing. The picture there is of a report that we did on Tay-Sachs disease, which was on a review of carrier screening for Tay-Sachs disease, which is one of the conditions that affects the Jewish communities, and they're particularly at risk of this. With single gene disorders, even later in life, we can spot people with breast cancer mutations, for example, who are more likely to get breast cancer or ovarian cancer. The picture here is of familial hypercholesterolemia, the characteristic damage to the hands, and again we can spot people with the FH mutations. We can follow up family members and make sure we have treatment at an early stage. I put here again ways of preventing single gene disorders. We have the newborn screening heel prick test that many of you will know about. That the panel of testing has recently been expanded, and here it's a very good way of spotting babies who are likely to be very seriously ill, often very soon after birth, who can be treated with either special diets or sometimes even enzyme replacement therapy. And increasingly, people will be getting results from a whole genome screen, whether that's part of the 100,000 genome research study or otherwise, program or otherwise. And here they may well find out about conditions that they're at risk of that have actually nothing to do with the original clinical reason for why the test was done. This is a picture of one of the first families that where a kidney disease was at the molecular abnormality of kidney disease was actually found through whole genome screening, and that had great implications for family members who could then be tested to see if they were also at risk. So there's lots of ways of preventing disease in single gene disorders. As we get to multifactorial conditions, it actually gets rather more difficult. So looking, for example, at risks of diabetes, most people will know that obesity, lack of exercise is an important risk factor. There are people that have increased genetic susceptibility to diabetes, factors affecting beta cells, or various ways in which the pathology comes about. And there are actually also monogenic forms of diabetes that can be diagnosed in either neonatal stage or usually in younger people. And at the PhD Foundation, we've recently done reviews of both diabetes and obesity to look at what the genetic susceptibility might be, and to see if there's any sort of ways of intervening differently in those conditions and giving a better understanding of susceptibility. And one of the problems is that actually understanding genetic susceptibility so far in conditions such as obesity or diabetes doesn't really help in knowing what advice to give people. So it is still, watch your diet, take plenty of exercise. It's still all of the general things. In cardiovascular disease, we've been recently involved with work, again looking at whether it's possible to fine-tune the risk estimates by doing genetic testing and understanding the susceptibility. But again, it depends whether it changes the advice that you give people, because we've got fantastic ways of already understanding cardiovascular risk through family history, age, sex, lifestyle, exercise, smoking, all of those things, blood cholesterol, and actually, in many ways, genetic susceptibility doesn't actually really affect our understanding of that very much. So the advice that you give people is very similar, and in fact, it's also pretty clear that telling people that they have a genetic susceptibility to one of these conditions doesn't make a lot of difference to whether they are more likely to take more exercise, stop smoking, or whatever. Sometimes it just worries them a little bit, but they go back to what they were doing anyway. So there is an issue about some of the complexity of introducing, measuring genomic susceptibility variants within some of those lifestyle tests, and I think Alison's going to talk about that a little bit more, but there are regulatory complexities as you put genetic testing into the algorithms that are involved in coming out with a risk estimate, that a lot of people actually don't realise they would probably be classed as in vitro diagnostics and come into those regulatory provisions. In terms of gene-environment interaction, we're increasingly understanding more about how food and susceptibility to disease interact. So celiac disease there is a good example, and environmental pollutions, medicines, infectious agents, vaccines. I've mentioned those earlier. In terms of how you would prevent from specific hazards, though, it's actually quite complicated to think what you would do as a society, really. Does healthcare, would we have a duty to understand people's susceptibility to risk, to have actually measured it and note that and actually give them specific warnings about exposures that they should avoid or medicines that they should avoid? What would we be doing about safe levels of environmental hazards? I mean, as we've said, some people will be much more, for the sake of argument, likely to have an adverse reaction if they're exposed to a paint solvent. You know, does that mean they should not be allowed to be exposed in that environment? What are the implications for employers in understanding the nature of these risks? And how are we going to set safe levels of exposure, for example, to radiation or whatever? You know, we can't set levels that are different for different people. So there are complexities of starting to introduce our understanding of different susceptibilities to risk. But I wanted to really say a little bit about one of the areas I think is very complex, is how we empower patients to become involved as partners in that. What will be the role of healthcare, and what will be the role of public health, what will be their concerns. So just moving on, empowerment of patients. There's a lot of people talk about empowerment, patient empowerment. It's a very good buzzword, but what does it really mean, and what do we hope to achieve by it? So it means self-determining, or with power over our own health and healthcare, agreeing to a healthcare plan, being part of that decision-making. But life is getting much more and more complicated, I think. And to be empowered, you have to understand, you probably have to have some education, you need to be probably counselled and coached on this. And obviously people will, to some extent, empower themselves by looking at the internet, by being involved with patient organisations or involved in their communities. But it has to be a two-way thing, and if we're thinking about healthcare services, we actually also need to have healthcare services that understand all of the complexities of genomic susceptibility, personalised medicine as we move on to it, to be able to explain what the choices are, what the risks are, what the choices are, what the potential of different actions will be. And I think we're quite a long way from achieving that. Underlying all of that, we are assuming that empowered individuals will actually make more rational healthcare decisions, and hope that they will depend less on healthcare and it will all be more cost effective. But I think that is yet still to be decided or underpinned by evidence. And if we just think about getting genomic medicine right, I'm involved with the Royal College of Physicians group, and we're concerned about how you educate physicians to start doing genomic medicine. There are 230,000 physicians in this country registered with the GMC, and there are, as I've put up there, 73,000 and 60,000 that are actually registered specialists, either in specialist practice or in general practice. And the president of the Royal College of Physicians a couple of years ago, after a report we did, said there's few of these specialists will escape the impact of genomics in the next few years. And there are some initiatives to develop genomics education on a national basis. So you can look at the National Genetics and Genomics Education Centre, the work of Health Education England, the new genomic masters courses that are being introduced, and there is a certain amount of online learning. But I think this is only going to scratch the surface of what physicians need to be able to do over the next few years to really embed personalised prevention and personalised medicine. And just as an introduction to that, as part of our group, we have started to be developing resources which are available on our website that actually start to say, why is genomics important for prevention, for personalised medicine, for everything in dermatology, in cardiology, in nephrology, in respiratory medicine, in rheumatology, and it's important in all of those specialties. So there's some very nice introductory resources now available on our website, aimed really at physicians in the different specialties. Coming on, just thinking about the personalisation and the public health perspective, it's actually quite complicated in the sense that public health is in the big picture and things that all populations need to do. And they tend to think about genomics and personalisation as being about rare diseases or something that's not really relevant for big population programs. And I think that what is needed is to try and find that complementarity between the public health programs and the people who say, yes, actually we can use these technologies to prevent medicine better, to prevent disease better, to diagnose and treat it better. One of the problems with public health is that they say, well, you know, if you start saying that people are at different risk of cancer or different risk of heart disease, or some people will respond differently to different foods, you'll just dilute the whole of the message, and we're only just managing to get the message across about eating plenty of greens and taking plenty of exercise and so on, and the public will lose confidence. So there is a lot of work to be done with public health. I think we need to start thinking differently about screening. Again, the national screening programs, which have recently been reviewed, are not very clear about screening for risk. They're not very tailored towards either genetic testing, which again they see as fairly rare and about very small numbers of people. And they're not very keen on the idea of moving away from massive one-size-fits-all programs, such as big breast screening programs, to think more about how you might stratify and offer different programs to different people, or people might choose different programs. So one of the areas that we've looked at has actually been looking at breast screening, and this is a very good example where if you stratified according to the top line is stratifying according to age, and the lower line is stratifying according to risk, and actually potentially offer breast screening to younger people that were at higher risk. And you can see just with this modelling, and Laura's in the audience, she did some of this work with us, you could actually screen far fewer people and pick up almost the same number of cancers. And that way you don't expose women to unnecessary breast screening, the risk of false positives and biopsies and so on, when they were actually at very low risk, and you can provide a much more cost-effective programme. But how you would start to enact such a programme within the UK would take quite a lot of working through. I'm not going to say very much about the evidence base, but often we are talking about rare disorders, and there's always a problem in the evidence base that we're splitting things up into smaller and smaller groups. So finding out the evidence of what works in those smaller groups ends up being quite problematic. The UK Genetic Testing Network has quite a comprehensive set of evidence about the utility of several hundred genetic testing, again in rare conditions, but the evidence is nowhere near as comprehensive as major population programs might be requiring, because there simply just aren't the large cohorts and the methodologies. So, in conclusion, I've tried to say here that I think prevention is a very important part of the personalisation agenda in this country and in the world indeed. It's not widely discussed, and I think that's possibly at the moment because lots of the sort of industry and commercials perspective and a lot of the science perspective in a sense is very much focused around molecular diagnosis and personalised medicine that's really involving companion diagnostics and matching treatments. And I think that the prevention agenda is something that hasn't really received as much attention, but I think there are a huge amount of potential for actually preventing disease, particularly in people that are at risk of rare diseases, but also I think over the next 5 to 10 years there will become opportunities for thinking how we stratify risk for the more common complex disorders and work out better ways of approaching prevention in the population on a stratified basis. I've mentioned the issues there that involve how on earth we do this patient empowerment. I think we have to do more than just talk about it. How we develop a healthcare service that is really able to deliver personalised medicine, how we integrate with the public health programmes, and developing the evidence base. Actually, it's becoming clear that nobody is really average. All of our all of our evidence is actually based on whole big cohorts and what the average of that population achieves in terms of effective interventions or effective outcomes. And actually, there are people that will have fantastic outcomes with any of those cohorts. There'll be people who will have terrible outcomes, and we're not very good at differentiating those. And then the evidence just kind of irons across the whole as a whole. So it's actually very difficult to know how you advise individuals. But that's all I was going to say on that.